Donald Trump faces off with a veteran. His next move shocks the nation. A brave American soldier rises in the middle of a grand hall filled with the most powerful politicians in the country. He locks eyes with President Donald Trump and speaks words that make the entire nation hold its breath. "Mr. President, I fought for this country, but when I came home, my country abandoned me." And the room falls silent, advisors exchange nervous glances, and Secret Service agents tighten their earpieces. This isn't a scripted question, it's a direct confrontation. But what President Trump does next, no one sees coming. A bold decision made live on national television shakes the very foundation of American politics, turning this once-forgotten soldier into a figure that sends shivers through Washington's corridors of power. What happened next? Who tried to silence him? And can one ordinary man truly take on an entire system built to keep people like him quiet? Stay until the end to uncover the full truth. Caleb Morgan was a soldier, but not just any soldier. He had served in the 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the most elite units in the U.S. Army, carrying out some of the most dangerous missions imaginable. He had survived brutal combat in Afghanistan, where a single mistake could mean death for him or his brothers in arms. He had fought, bled, and watched his friends die in service of America. Caleb returned home after 8 years of service. He had imagined stepping off the plane to cheers, handshakes, and a hero's welcome. But reality was far colder than he had ever expected. On his first day back, he stood in front of an empty apartment. No one was there to greet him. No phone calls from those who once promised to help him readjust. Just a stack of unpaid bills piling up on his kitchen counter. Red ink screaming overdue balances. And a letter from the bank notifying him that his account was dangerously low. He began applying for jobs. A decorated veteran with proven leadership skills, crisis management experience, and the ability to make life or death decisions under pressure, and he believed he would land a meaningful position in no time. But reality hit him like a punch to the gut. Over 50 job applications, every single one rejected. One company told him he lacked civilian work experience. Another mentioned the psychological toll of his military service. Some never even responded. That was when Caleb began to understand a bitter truth. America needs its soldiers in battle, but when they come home, society no longer has a place for them. The very people who had risked their lives for their country were being abandoned by the very nation they swore to protect. Every morning, he woke up hoping for an email, a phone call, some sign that his life was moving forward. Instead, all he received were bank notices about late fees and eviction threats. His rent was 2 months overdue. His landlord had given 3 warnings. He knew that if he didn't find a way to fix things soon, he would be forced onto the streets. The same streets on which so many forgotten veterans already lived. One morning, Caleb stepped outside and saw a notice pinned to his door. It was a short, brutal, unforgiving eviction notice. "You have 7 days to vacate." He stood there, gripping the paper, his hands shaking with anger. Not because he was afraid of being homeless, but because of the sheer injustice of it all. He had saved countless lives on the battlefield. He had stood between death and his fellow soldiers to defend American freedom. But when he needed help, not a single hand reached out to him. Caleb turned back inside and slammed the door behind him. His eyes locked onto the television screen where a news anchor was talking about how the U.S. economy was booming, unemployment rates were at historic lows, and the government was providing full support to veterans. He let out a dry, bitter laugh. Numbers meant nothing to men like him. Then a familiar face appeared on the screen. President Donald Trump, standing behind a podium, speaking about his reforms, about making America great again. And that's when an idea struck Caleb. He could sit here waiting for an opportunity that would never come, Or he could stand up, walk out that door, and take his future into his own hands. He grabbed his laptop and started searching. In 3 days, President Trump was scheduled to hold a major press conference in Washington, D.C., an event that would gather the country's top journalists, broadcast live on national television. He didn't have an invitation. He wasn't a journalist, but he was a soldier, and soldiers always find a way to complete their mission. Caleb knew this plan was insane. It was a gamble, a long shot, a mission with no backup and no guarantees. But he also knew one thing for certain: he had nothing left to lose. He pulled his old jacket from the hook by the door, took one last look around his empty apartment, and then stepped outside, ready for the biggest battle of his life, not on foreign soil, not against enemy combatants, but right here in the heart of America. Caleb knew that getting into a U.S. presidential press conference without an invitation was impossible. Security would be at the highest level, every attendee pre-screened, every name on an approved list. For any ordinary person, this would be a dead end. But Caleb Morgan was not an ordinary person. For 3 days, he studied everything about the venue, a luxurious hotel in the heart of Washington, D.C., examining the building layout, entry points, press zones, and security checkpoints. This was not a battlefield, but the invisible barriers here were just as impenetrable. He had no time to wait for an opportunity. He had to create one. On the morning of the press conference, Caleb stood before a mirror, adjusting his dark jacket around his neck. He slung a camera, one he had picked up from a second-hand store the day before. He had no press credentials, no official badge, but sometimes paperwork mattered less than how you carried yourself. Confidence could open doors that even power could not. Arriving early, he observed the steady flow of journalists from CNN, Fox News, and the Washington Post, all moving swiftly, their press passes gleaming around their necks. Security guards barely glanced at them, and that's when Caleb saw the flaw in the system. The only way to get in was to blend in. Taking a deep breath, he stepped toward a group of reporters from the Washington Post, his notebook in hand, adopting the hurried, distracted demeanor of a journalist prepping for a big interview at the checkpoint. A security officer glanced at the group, briefly scanning his list. Then, with a nod, he waved them through. Caleb was just a few steps from getting inside when a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey, you! Stop!" His pulse pounded. Turning slowly, he found himself face to face with a Secret Service agent. A tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp, assessing eyes. "Where's your press badge?" the agent asked, his tone firm but measured. Caleb didn't flinch. Hesitation was failure. His eyes flickered briefly to the name tag on the agent's chest. Agent Mason. With steady confidence, Caleb replied, "Agent Mason, right? I'm Caleb Morgan, independent journalist. I cover veteran affairs." Agent Mason didn't move. His arms remained crossed, unimpressed. No badge, no entry. Caleb held his gaze. "I'm a former Army Ranger. I fought for this country. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need a chance to speak the truth, and I think you, as someone who wears the uniform, understand that better than anyone." The tension hung thick in the air. Caleb had one shot. 1 second, 2, 3, and then Agent Mason, side-glancing around discreetly, leaned in. "Last row. Don't cause a scene." Caleb gave a small nod, silent gratitude, before stepping inside. He had made it. The conference hall was massive, illuminated by powerful stage lights. Rows of seats stretched across the room, every detail pristine and presidential. On stage, the podium bore the seal of the President of the United States. Hundreds of reporters were setting up their cameras, checking mics, and exchanging notes. Caleb took a seat in the back row, his palms slightly damp with sweat. He had gotten in, but how was he going to get the entire country to listen? The press conference began. One by one, journalists stood to ask questions about foreign policy, economic growth, military spending. Topics that meant nothing to the veterans abandoned by the system. Time was slipping away. Caleb knew that if he didn't act now, he would lose his only chance. A final question was asked, something about defense budgets. President Trump answered briefly, then turned to consult with an aide. Caleb's heart pounded. Now or never. He gripped the arms of his chair, then stood. "Mr. President." The room froze. Hundreds of heads snapped toward him and cameras swiveled. Trump stopped mid-sentence, narrowing his eyes at the unknown voice that had broken protocol. Secret Service agents tensed, several of them reaching for their earpieces. Caleb took a deep breath, steadied his voice, and spoke. "I'm Caleb Morgan. I fought for this country, but when I came home, I was abandoned." Silence fell. Every journalist, every government official, every security agent in the room stilled. Trump's gaze locked onto Caleb, his expression unreadable. He placed both hands on the podium, tilting his head slightly. Then he spoke. "What do you want?" His voice was not angry, not dismissive. It was considering, weighing. Caleb felt the full weight of the moment. No fear, no nerves, only purpose. He took another breath and answered clearly, deliberately. "I want justice for every veteran this system has abandoned." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick enough to cut with a knife. And then something no one expected happened. Trump slowly nodded. Then, in a firm, deliberate voice, he said, "All right then, tell me. How has this system failed you?" Caleb clenched his fists, knowing that the opportunity he had risked everything for had just fallen into his hands. Caleb stood in the middle of the grand conference hall, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes fixed on him. Reporters sat in stunned silence, their microphones lowered, fingers frozen over keyboards. Nobody had expected an unknown man to interrupt a U.S. presidential press conference at the front of the room. Donald Trump studied him with an intense gaze, but instead of anger or impatience, the president's expression showed something else. Curiosity. "What did you just say?" Trump asked, his voice measured and deliberate. Caleb took a steady breath, ensuring his voice remained unwavering. "My name is Caleb Morgan," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of frustration. "I served in the 75th Ranger Regiment. I took on the most dangerous missions to protect this country, but when I came home, I was abandoned. I applied for more than 50 jobs. Every single one rejected me. I followed every rule, did everything the government asked of me, fought, served, sacrificed, and yet when I needed help, my country turned its back on me." The room remained deathly silent. Some reporters scrambled to jot down his words. Others began live streaming. Caleb's voice tightened with restraint, but the fire in his words only grew stronger. "Mr. President, you stand here today talking about economic growth, about record low unemployment, but do you know that thousands of veterans like me still can't find work? We don't need charity, we need an opportunity." Trump crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly as he considered Caleb's words. He didn't dismiss him. He didn't call security. Instead, he simply asked, "What do you want?" The question rippled through the room. It wasn't condescending, it wasn't dismissive. It was a challenge. Caleb locked eyes with the president. "I want your administration to stop making empty promises and start taking real action. I want to see veterans actually get the support they deserve, not just campaign slogans." A murmur spread among Trump's advisors, some visibly uneasy. Among them, Director Anderson, a senior White House official, narrowed his eyes in irritation. This was not part of the script. One aide leaned in, whispering something into Trump's ear, but Trump simply waved them off, his gaze never leaving Caleb. "I don't like complainers," he said bluntly. "I like doers, so tell me, What's your solution? Caleb clenched his fist. This was his moment. There was no turning back. I'm not just speaking for myself, he declared. I'm speaking for every veteran out there who's struggling to survive. I want the government to create a real hiring initiative for veterans. Not just token programs, but real jobs where we can apply the skills we learned in combat. For a few seconds, Trump said nothing. The entire room held its breath. Then the president turned to Director Anderson. Do we have any open positions in the Department of Veterans Affairs? Director Anderson looked blindsided, his gaze darting between Trump and Caleb, but he quickly regained composure. There are a few positions available, Mr. President, but government hiring is a complex process. Trump cut him off with a wave of his hand. This man has leadership experience. He's handled pressure in ways none of us here ever have, and he's willing to fight for veterans. Then, turning back to Caleb, Trump asked, Do you want a job? Caleb didn't hesitate. I want a job, but not just a desk job. I want a chance to fix this system. A small smirk played on Trump's lips. He liked boldness. Then turned to Anderson and find him a position at the VA. I want him in the department by next week. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters whispered frantically. Cameras zoomed in on Caleb. Nobody could believe what they had just witnessed. The President of the United States on live television offering a job to a complete stranger simply because he spoke the truth. Director Anderson's smile was forced, but behind his expression, his eyes gleamed with something far more dangerous. This was not what he wanted. He had spent decades navigating the government machine, ensuring that only the right people, his people, held power, and he knew troublemakers like Caleb Morgan were the most dangerous kind of men. Trump extended his hand toward Caleb, a handshake in front of millions of viewers. Caleb stepped forward, gripping the president's hand firmly. I won't let you down, he vowed, his voice filled with determination. Trump grinned slightly. Good, because if you do, I'll be the first one to fire you. The press conference exploded into a frenzy of questions, but Caleb barely heard them. He had walked in hoping to be heard, and now he was walking out with a mission far bigger than himself. A chance to change the lives of thousands of veterans just like him. But as he left the conference hall, he wasn't the only one deep in thought. From the shadows, Director Anderson watched him leave, his expression dark and unreadable. He knew this game had just changed, and he wasn't about to let some unknown soldier ruin everything he had built. Caleb Morgan had never imagined himself walking through the halls of American political power. Yet just a week after the press conference that changed everything, he stood in front of the Department of Veterans Affairs headquarters, an imposing marble building, a symbol of Washington's bureaucratic machine. He stared at the large sign that read, Department of Veterans Affairs, took a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy doors. Inside, the atmosphere was nothing like the battlefield he knew. No gunfire, no urgent commands, no life or death decisions made in split seconds. Here, there was only the rhythmic clatter of keyboards, muffled conversations, and the suffocating weight of stagnation. The young receptionist glanced up from her desk, momentarily startled by the tall, broad-shouldered man with a military posture that stood out sharply in a place dominated by government suits. Caleb Morgan? She asked, scanning her computer screen. That's me, he nodded. Director Anderson is expecting you in his office. Director Anderson, that name wasn't unfamiliar. Caleb had seen him at the press conference last week, had seen the cold calculation in his eyes. He hadn't even tried to hide his displeasure when Caleb had forced the president's hand on national television. Anderson had been in charge of the VA for over 2 decades. He wasn't the kind of man who welcomed change, and he sure as hell wouldn't welcome Caleb Morgan. Caleb walked down the long hallway lined with framed portraits of past VA secretaries. Each face represented a legacy, most of them forgotten, most of them part of the same endless bureaucratic cycle. When he reached the large wooden door, he took one last deep breath before stepping inside. Anderson sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, his face unreadable as he studied Caleb. He was in his 60s, his silver hair neatly combed, his expensive tailored suit pristine. Everything about him screamed authority, a man who had played the Washington game long enough to master it. Caleb barely had time to speak before Anderson leaned forward, his voice calm, deliberate, but heavy with power. "Morgan, I hope you understand something. This isn't Afghanistan, and we don't fight with guns here. We fight with procedures, paperwork, and politics." Caleb held his gaze steady. "Then I assume you understand I didn't come here to waste time on bureaucracy." Anderson smirked, but his eyes remained cold. "Bureaucracy is what keeps the system running. Do you really think that one press conference gives you the power to walk in here and change things?" Caleb leaned in slightly, his voice low but razor-sharp. "No, I don't. But I do think that if this system refuses to change, I'll make sure it has no choice." The air in the room grew thick with unspoken tension. There were two men standing on opposite sides of a battlefield. One had controlled this system for years, and the other had just arrived, but was already a threat. Finally, Anderson sighed, as if giving in. "Fine. You want to work, I'll give you an assignment. Consider it a test." He stood up, walked to a filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder from the bottom drawer. He placed it in front of Caleb, tapping the cover with his fingers. "These are veterans' claims that have been sitting in limbo. Some have been delayed for over a decade. There's a process in place to resolve them, but for various reasons, things move slowly. If you truly care about veterans, start here." Caleb opened the file, flipping through the pages. Requests for disability compensation, appeals for denied medical benefits, letters from men and women who had once carried rifles and faced death head-on, now trapped in an endless bureaucratic nightmare. He looked back at Anderson, his eyes now burning with something sharper than frustration. Rage. "How long have these people been waiting?" he demanded. Anderson shrugged. 10 years? 15? Some even longer? A wave of anger rose inside Caleb. "And you're telling me the system just left them hanging like this?" Anderson folded his arms, his voice completely indifferent. "Like I said, Morgan, this isn't a battlefield. If you think you can solve this with passion alone, you'll quickly learn that Washington doesn't work that way." Caleb gripped the file tightly. He had fought enemies in war zones, but now he realized his hardest battle would be against the very system he was trying to fix. He stood up, his voice steady but filled with quiet determination. "I'll go through these cases, and I'll make sure they get resolved." Anderson smiled, stepping toward the door and pulling it open. A silent message that this conversation was over. "Good. Best of luck, Morgan," he said with a smirk. "Something tells me you're going to need it." As Caleb walked out, his mind was heavy with the weight of what he had just seen. He glanced down at the file in his hands, and for the first time, he truly understood his purpose in this fight. He hadn't come here to push papers. He had come here to wage war, and he wouldn't stop until every veteran forgotten by this system finally got the justice they deserved. Caleb Morgan sat in his cramped office, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows over the towering stack of files in front of him. It had been 3 days since he started his new role at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and in that time he had done nothing but dig through the mountain of documents Director Anderson had given him. Page after page, he scanned the lifeless words, the cold bureaucratic language. But behind each sheet of paper, behind each case number, were not just files, they were lives. Men and women who had once fought to protect their country, now trapped in an endless bureaucratic nightmare. Caleb flipped open one particular case. Jacob Ellis, a former sergeant in Iraq who lost a leg to an IED explosion. He had applied for disability benefits in 2009. Now, in 2024, he was still waiting for a final response. 15 years. Caleb clenched the paper in his hands, his pulse quickening. This wasn't an isolated case. He continued flipping. One case detailed a sniper from Afghanistan, denied mental health support and left to battle PTSD alone until he took his own life. Another involved a single mother who had served as a combat medic, denied medical coverage for no clear reason, and forced to choose between feeding her child or paying for her own hospital bills. This wasn't just negligence. This was systematic failure, or worse, intentional. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't change a decades-old system alone, but he also knew one thing for sure. If this truth saw the light of day, America wouldn't be able to ignore it. He needed an ally. Caleb reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he landed on a name. Laura Stevens. She was a renowned investigative journalist for the Washington Post. She had exposed corruption in the Department of Health, forcing a high-ranking official to resign. She wasn't afraid of powerful people. And more importantly, she cared about the truth. Caleb tapped the call button. Laura answered after 2 rings. "Caleb Morgan, I figured you'd call me eventually," he smirked. "Then I guess you already know what I'm about to say." Laura paused, then replied, "I'm guessing you have a story that some people don't want the world to hear?" Caleb nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Not just a story, a reality that thousands of veterans are suffering through, and I need your help to expose it." A short silence followed, then Laura's voice came back, steady but sharp. "Meet me at the cafe near Capitol Hill in 1 hour. Caleb didn't hesitate. He shut the file, stuffed it into his leather bag, and walked out the door. 1 hour later, Caleb entered the bustling cafe, scanning the room. Laura was already seated in the back corner, a notebook and laptop in front of her. She was in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed, focused, the kind of journalist who didn't waste time on small talk. As Caleb sat down, she got straight to the point. "Show me." Caleb unzipped his bag, pulling out the thick stack of documents and placing them in front of her. Laura flipped through them quickly but carefully, her keen eyes scanning each line. The more she read, the darker her expression became. Then, under her breath, she muttered, "Jesus Christ." She shook her head. "This isn't a backlog issue. Some of these claims were deliberately delayed, without justification." Caleb nodded. "And I believe someone inside the VA is making sure it stays that way." Laura leaned in slightly, her curiosity now fully piqued. "Do you have any solid evidence?" Without a word, Caleb pulled out a printed email and slid it across the table. Laura picked it up. It was an internal memo from a senior official, explicitly ordering delays on certain claims in order to maintain budget balance. Laura exhaled sharply and looked up at Caleb. "If I publish this, will you go on record?" Caleb didn't hesitate. He knew that by going public, he wasn't just exposing a broken system, he was making enemies. Enemies who had spent years ensuring the system remained broken. But he also knew that if he didn't do this, thousands of veterans would remain forgotten, so he met Laura's gaze and said, "I will." Laura studied him for a moment, then without another word she closed her notebook, took a sip of coffee and grabbed her phone. "Then buckle up, Morgan, because once this story breaks, there's no turning back." 2 days later, the Washington Post dropped the biggest bombshell story of the year. Buried Truth: How the VA System is Failing America's Veterans. The article spread like wildfire. CNN, Fox News, NBC, every major news outlet picked up the story. Veterans across the country started coming forward, sharing their own horror stories. Social media exploded, and the pressure on the VA became unbearable. They were forced to hold an emergency press conference. But when Caleb arrived at VA headquarters, he immediately sensed something was off. Co-workers avoided eye contact, whispers followed him down the hallway, and then, just before he reached his office, a man in a black suit blocked his path. No words, just a thick envelope handed to him. Caleb took it, ripped it open, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was short, blunt, and chilling. From now on, every move you make will be watched. If you keep pushing, there will be consequences. Caleb gripped the letter tightly, his jaw clenching. He had just stepped into a much bigger war than he ever imagined. But if they thought a thinly veiled threat would scare him, they didn't know Caleb Morgan. And that only made him more determined. Caleb Morgan had braced himself for a tough fight, but he never expected the counterattack to come this fast or be this dangerous. The moment the Washington Post published its explosive report, his phone never stopped ringing. Veterans from all over the country reached out, sharing their stories and offering their support. On social media, Justice for Veterans exploded. What started as one man's fight had now turned into a nationwide movement. But the brighter the light of justice shone, the faster the shadows fought back. The day after the article dropped, Caleb walked into the Department of Veterans Affairs and immediately felt the shift in the air. Colleagues who once greeted him warmly now avoided his gaze, and whispers followed him down the hallway. He had become a threat, a name people were afraid to be associated with. As soon as he sat down at his desk, the internal phone rang sharply. A cold, emotionless voice came through the receiver. "Morgan, Director Anderson wants to see you now." Caleb exhaled slowly, set the phone down, and stood up. He knew this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. Inside Director Anderson's office, the most powerful man in the VA? Anderson stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring down at the bustling city below. He didn't even turn around when he spoke. His voice was slow, deliberate, dripping with menace. "Do you have any idea what you've just done, Morgan?" Caleb held his ground. "I did what was right. I exposed the truth." Finally, Anderson turned his eyes cold and razor-sharp. "The truth?" He let out a short, humorless chuckle. "You think the truth changes anything? This system has been running for decades. It follows rules you can't even begin to comprehend. A single article won't break it." Caleb smirked. "No, but it makes the whole country pay attention." Anderson took a slow step forward, his voice dropping to a warning tone. "You're making enemies, Morgan, dangerous ones, and you don't even realize who you're up against." Caleb clenched his fists. "If you're trying to threaten me, just say it outright." Anderson laughed softly, shaking his head. "Threats? No, Morgan, I'm just giving you a reality check. You've stepped into a game you can't win." Caleb met his gaze without blinking. "I fought in Afghanistan. Every day, I woke up knowing it could be my last. You think I'm scared of some bureaucrat in a suit?" Anderson's expression darkened. He walked over to his desk, pulled out a thick folder, and slid it across the table toward Caleb. "Then tell me, Morgan, what do you think about this?" Caleb opened the folder, and his stomach twisted with rage. Inside were fabricated reports, false allegations meant to destroy him, fake claims about his military service, accusations of misconduct in combat, even a pending hit piece from a major news outlet titled "Caleb Morgan, Hero or Dangerous Agitator." Caleb's jaw tightened as he looked back up. "You plan to ruin me?" Anderson shrugged. When someone becomes too much of a problem, the system takes care of them. Caleb slowly closed the folder, tapping his fingers on the cover. You can print whatever you want, but I'm not stopping. Anderson leaned back in his chair, a predatory smirk crossing his face. I look forward to seeing how far you make it. Caleb turned and walked out, but as he closed the door behind him, he knew the battle had just reached a new level, a much more dangerous one. That night, as Caleb stepped out of the VA building, he immediately felt it. Something was off. The streets were still busy, but one car stood out. A black SUV parked across the street, engine running with no one getting out. Caleb's instincts kicked in. His combat training took over. He acted casual, but his pace slowed subtly, taking in every detail, the make, the tinted windows, the lack of plates. When he reached his block, the SUV started rolling forward, matching his pace. Caleb stopped, so did the SUV. A cold chill ran down his spine. Slowly he turned to face the vehicle. The passenger window lowered just enough. Inside, a middle-aged man with dead, calculating eyes met his gaze. His voice was low, steady, and full of warning. Morgan, you're stepping too far. Caleb didn't flinch. The man tilted his head slightly, studying him like a predator assessing prey. Then, with the slightest smirk, no one to stop. The window rolled up and the SUV pulled away, disappearing into the night. Caleb stood frozen for a second, his heart hammering, not with fear, but with pure determination. They thought they could scare him off. They thought a whispered warning would be enough. But what they didn't understand was this. Caleb Morgan never backed down, and he wasn't about to start now. Caleb Morgan knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just sit back and wait to be taken down. If the underground powers had already issued their warning, he had to hit back. And not just with a simple response. It had to be a strike so powerful they couldn't ignore it. Sitting in his small apartment, Caleb stared at his laptop screen, overflowing with emails and messages from veterans all over the country. Their stories were all the same: forgotten, abandoned, overlooked. Each message was more than just another testimony. They were evidence. And more than that, they were his most powerful weapon: the truth. Caleb understood something that bureaucrats like Director Anderson didn't. This system wasn't going to change because of a meeting or a single news article. If he wanted to shake it to its core, he needed the power of the people. So he picked up his phone. Laura Stevens answered on the second ring. "I assume you have something big for me?" Her sharp voice carried a hint of curiosity. Caleb didn't waste time. A single article isn't enough. I need the entire country to see this truth. There was a short silence, then Laura spoke. "You're thinking about live television, not just that," Caleb said. "I want a public forum, a live event where veterans can stand up and speak for themselves. We bring in the press. We make sure the whole world is watching. We force the government to act." Laura let out a short, amused laugh. "Bold move, Morgan, but you realize this'll make you an even bigger target, right?" Caleb glanced out the window, his mind flashing back to the black SUV and the silent threat from the man in the shadows. He knew the risk, but fear was not part of his vocabulary. "I've fought in real wars, Laura. I'm not scared of a bunch of corrupt politicians." Laura sighed. "All right. I'll get the major news networks on board. Where's this event happening?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "The Capitol, right in front of the Department of Veterans Affairs." There was a pause, then Laura laughed again. "You really have no fear, do you?" Caleb smirked. "I didn't come here to live forever. I came here to change things." 3 days later, the square in front of the Department of Veterans Affairs was packed. Hundreds of veterans had gathered, many holding signs with bold messages. "We are not invisible. Justice for veterans. Support, not delays." Major news outlets, from CNN and Fox News to NBC, had cameras rolling. Caleb stood on a small stage facing the crowd. He looked into the eyes of men and women who had served, their faces lined with pain, frustration, and defiance. They weren't here to beg. They were here to be heard. He took the microphone, his voice steady, strong, but filled with emotion. Today, we are not here to ask for pity. We are here to demand what is rightfully ours. The crowd roared, camera lenses zoomed in, capturing the fire in his eyes. I have seen too many of my brothers and sisters left behind, waiting for years just to have our government acknowledge that we deserve the help we were promised. I have seen soldiers stare death in the face every day, only to come home and be destroyed by something worse: neglect. The crowd erupted in applause. Then an elderly veteran stepped forward, gripping the microphone with trembling hands. "I filed my disability claim back in 2005, he said, his voice raw with emotion. "They told me to wait and wait and wait again. I'm 72 years old now. How much longer do I have to wait?" A heavy silence fell. Then an explosion of outrage from the crowd. A female veteran stepped up next. "I was a combat nurse. I was injured in the line of duty. They told me I'd get help. Instead, they erased my name from the system. I lost everything." The anger spread like wildfire. Millions were watching from their screens. Social media exploded with reactions. Then it happened. Security officers emerged from the VA building, their faces unreadable. One of them approached Caleb, whispering something in his ear. Caleb tightened his grip on the mic. "They want us to stop. They say we are disturbing public order." The crowd booed loudly. Some reporters immediately turned to the officers, firing off questions. No answers came. Caleb turned toward the live cameras, staring straight into the lens. "If telling the truth is a crime, then go ahead and arrest me." Nobody moved. The security officers hesitated. Nobody wanted to be the one to drag a veteran off stage in front of millions of people. And at that moment, Caleb knew he had won a battle. This was no longer just about him. He had ignited something too big to be silenced. Inside the White House, in an elegant, dimly lit office, Director Anderson watched everything unfold on a large television screen. His usual calm, arrogant smirk was gone. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: real danger. A nervous aide entered. "Sir, should we issue a response?" Director Anderson took a slow sip of whiskey, his eyes dark and unreadable. "No, but keep him under close surveillance. We'll find a way to silence him." The aide nodded and left. Anderson leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on the screen where Caleb Morgan was still speaking, still standing tall, still refusing to back down. Anderson knew this fight was far from over, and he needed to act fast, because if Caleb Morgan kept pushing forward, he might just bring the whole damn system crashing down. Caleb Morgan had started a storm, and this was a storm that could not be stopped. Within 24 hours of his speech in front of the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Justice for Veterans movement spread like wildfire across America. American news stations couldn't stop talking about the protest. Veterans from all over the country began sharing their stories, and for the first time, millions of Americans were asking the same question: what the hell is really happening inside the system? The pressure on the government reached an all-time high. The White House had no choice but to respond. Then the most important moment happened. President Donald Trump spoke. "I want a full-scale investigation into the Department of Veterans Affairs. I want to know why those who fought for this country are being treated this way, and I want answers immediately." That single order changed everything. Within days, internal audits were launched. Decades-old pending cases were suddenly being reviewed. The files that Caleb and Laura Stevens had uncovered were now being used as official evidence in federal hearings. Top officials in the Department of Veterans Affairs were summoned before Congress. Caleb, the forgotten soldier, was now the most talked about man in America. But in the shadows, Director Anderson was far from defeated. Late one night, while Caleb was in his office, Laura Stevens' voice came through urgently and panicked. "Caleb, I just got a leak. They're planning to take you down." Caleb clenched his jaw. "What do you mean? Anderson and his people are fabricating a scandal against you. They're planting evidence to make it look like you stole money from the Veterans Fund. If they succeed, your credibility will be destroyed, and you could be prosecuted." Caleb exhaled slowly. He wasn't surprised. This was the last move of desperate men. When they couldn't silence someone, they tried to destroy their reputation instead. "Do we have proof?" Caleb asked. Laura didn't hesitate. "One of my sources recorded a private meeting in which Anderson gives direct orders to set you up. If we release this, you're finished." Caleb closed his eyes for a brief moment. This was the moment of truth. If they published the recording, Anderson would be taken down. But at the same time, Caleb knew his life would never be the same again. He opened his eyes, his voice firm. "Do it. Release it." The next morning, the Washington Post dropped the biggest bombshell story of the year. Top VA official caught orchestrating smear campaign against whistleblower veteran. Attached to the article was the leaked recording, a clear, unmistakable voice giving orders. "Find a way to take Morgan down. I don't care how, just get it done." The story exploded. Congress demanded an immediate federal investigation, and the White House scrambled to control the fallout. Within 48 hours, Director Anderson resigned in disgrace. A powerful empire that had ruled for decades collapsed in just a matter of days. But the biggest twist of all was still coming. 2 weeks later, Caleb received a phone call from the White House. A familiar voice spoke. "Morgan, do you have time for a meeting?" It was President Donald Trump. In the Oval Office, Caleb stood across from the President of the United States. Trump studied him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You did something no one in my administration had the guts to do. You made this system look at itself in the mirror." Caleb stood tall, saying nothing. Trump continued, "I need people like you in my government." Caleb's eyebrows furrowed. "What are you saying?" Trump reached for a folder on his desk and slid it across. Caleb picked it up. As soon as he read the bold letters on the first page, his heart stopped. Presidential appointment, Acting Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Caleb Morgan. Caleb looked up, stunned. "You're asking me to run the entire department?" Trump nodded. "You expose the corruption, but that's not enough. I need you to fix this system from the inside." Caleb knew what this meant. If he accepted, he would be walking straight into the heart of the beast. Not longer fighting from the outside, but standing at the heart of the machine he had once battled against. He took a deep breath, then met Trump's gaze and nodded. "I won't let you down." Trump smirked. "Good, because if you do, I'll be the first one to fire you." Caleb let out a short laugh, but deep down he knew the truth. This was not the end of the fight, this was only the beginning. Caleb Morgan never imagined he would one day stand at the highest office of the Department of Veterans Affairs. But now he wasn't just standing there, he was leading it. On his first day as acting secretary, Caleb walked into the same building where he had once been an outsider, but this time, the way people looked at him had changed. Some were nervous, some were curious, but most, especially those who had once been forced into silence, looked at him with hope. Caleb knew that his fight was far from over. The battle against bureaucratic delay, corruption, and injustice was just beginning. But now he had something he never had before, the power to fix the system from within. And he didn't waste a second. In just 3 months, Caleb and his team launched a series of groundbreaking reforms. They reduced the processing time for veterans' claims from years to just a few months, created a transparent oversight system so no case could be hidden or delayed, and established a direct hotline so veterans could report their concerns without fear of being ignored. Most importantly, Caleb proved that one person willing to stand up can make a real difference. Caleb stood on a stage addressing a packed auditorium at one of the largest veterans conferences in the country. But this time he wasn't speaking to a forgotten crowd. These were not just names on ignored files anymore. These were people, men and women who had finally been heard. Caleb took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone. "When I started this fight, I had nothing. No power, no position. I only had the truth, and I was willing to fight for it." He looked directly into the cameras where millions of Americans were watching. "The system is not perfect, and I can't fix everything overnight, but I promise you this, from this moment on, no veteran will ever be forgotten again." The audience erupted into applause. A standing ovation lasted for minutes. Do you believe that those who sacrificed for this country deserve to be treated with dignity? Do you believe that one person, no matter how small, can stand up and change an entire system? If you do, share your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and share this video. Let the story of Caleb Morgan reach as many people as possible, and if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching. Never stop believing in the power of truth, never stop fighting for what's right, and most importantly, never forget that you have the power to change the world. See you in the next video.